Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Smart Tea podcast, where we talk about the lives of scientists and innovators who shape the world. How are you, Aarati?
I'm doing great, Arpita. How are you?
I'm good. Spring is springing here.
It is. I love it. The weather is so warm. I just went out for like half an hour today and just baked in the sun, and it was glorious. It was just, I was so warm afterwards. I was so happy.
You just a little marinate?
Yeah. And, my dog Cairo also will take any opportunity to come out with me and sit and sunbathe. So we just spent a little bit of quality time in the middle of the day, just warming ourselves. It was fantastic.
That sounds so nice. My cats do that too. I feel like there's more sunshine in the apartment too. It's like the little sunspots on the rugs or like on the floor. They'll just like curl themselves there. So they'll just roast in the sun.
Yes. It's amazing. Did you see the eclipse?
I did see the eclipse. I went outside with my protective glasses on my roof and saw our little thumbnail sun. It was very great.
Yeah, just like 40% or 50% coverage or something. But yeah, I saw it. I saw it as well. And again, I think my dog was like, "What are you doing?" You guys are whatever. I'm taking the opportunity to sit outside. But yeah, it was super cool.
My partner went to the Path of Totality, so he actually got to
Oh.
see the whole thing, and he said it was like one of the coolest experiences. So, the pictures that he has look amazing too, and like the sky goes dark and it gets cooler. It looks really, really cool.
I'm so jealous. I heard that like the hotels and Airbnbs and stuff on the Path of Totality were just insanely priced, like so expensive for that day.
Yeah, it seemed like they had a really, really fun time when he was booking it, which was like months ago. I was just like, okay, cool, like have fun with that. And then on the actual day, I was like, I'm kind of jealous.
Yeah.
I'm kind of jealous.
Yeah, it was so cool just to see 50%. It would have been awesome to see 100%. Okay, I'm jealous. Good for him, though.
Yeah. Well, so the next one, I was looking at the map. Do you want to take a trip to Madrid? We can go. We can go see the eclipse there.
Oh my God. Yes, let's one up him. Not only are we going to see the eclipse, we're going to see it in Madrid. Right.
Love that for us.
Yes, that'd be awesome. Oh my God, amazing. What else is new?
I went on my bachelorette trip this last weekend.
Yes.
We went to Portland, just outside of Portland, like Mount Hood area, like on the border between Oregon and Washington. And it was so lovely, just like kind of misty, Pacific Northwest rainy. I got to see some of my friends from college that I don't actually get to see very often.
Nice.
And just had that like quality time with your friends where you do like those belly laughs where you can't catch your breath,
Yeah.
and everyone was just having so much fun. So it was great. It was like great to have quality time and just be outdoors and have just like a fun time on a weekend. So I had a very, very lovely time. Anyone who's on that trip who's listening, I love and appreciate you very much. Thank you so much for hanging out with me.
I love Portland. Portland is so nice.
So nice.
Yeah. Have you been there before, or is this your first time?
I'd been to Portland a few times, but not so far out. Like I hadn't been to Mount Hood before. It was like a 45-minute drive away. So I've been to the city, but I hadn't actually done a lot of like nature exploring there, and it's so great. I would totally go back.
Gorgeous up there. Yeah.
Gorgeous up there.
Yeah.
What about you? What's new with you?
Oh, nothing so exciting as Portland. Oh, but so like the most exciting thing, honestly, that happened in my life this week is I finished my taxes, which I was just like, yes.
Okay, that's a huge accomplishment. Big
I know.
Claps.
I feel like I've been working on it for a month and it's finally done. So I'm like, oh, yes.
Especially a small business owner, like that can't be easy.
Oh my God. It's so annoying. And like, there's so many things. I really wish, like, I've been seeing all these TikTok videos about people who are saying like, the government knows how much we owe them. Why do they not just tell us and then we can pay and then we're done? And instead we have to fill out all of this paperwork and go through all these hoops. And I'm like, I'm 100% sure I filled it out wrong like the first 3 times and had to scrap it and start over again. And, finally, I think I figured it out. But
I think that every time. And then I think about the fact that I can't possibly be their target for auditing. So then I just stop worrying about it after that.
Yeah. I'm just like, oh man, if I get audited, have fun digging through the mess that is my file folders and stuff. And just tell me how much I owe you at that point, because I don't know.
What What happens if you get audited and then it's not the correct amount? Like, what happens? Like, do you get in trouble, or they just say your deficit this much and then you just pay that? Because that doesn't sound that bad.
I'm hoping it's the second.
Because, like, doesn't it just seem like someone checks your work? If that's the case, then, like, honestly, like, let's just get audited every year. Like, that's fine. But is it, like, bad? Like, do you get in trouble?
I don't know. Do you have to pay a penalty or something?
I mean, it's not evasion, right? It's not
Yeah.
evasion. You're just like, if you get the number wrong, like what? I feel like I'm going to have to edit this out because are we going to sound really dumb right now?
No. But like the other thing I was thinking is, why do they not teach you this in school? Like, why is there
that too?
Why is there no class in high school that's like, here's how you deal with all these forms and what all these numbers mean? And it's just like, oh my God, insane. But like, yeah, I did it. And oh, it's such a relief. I'm just like, okay. And I got the little thing from TurboTax saying your chances of being audited are very low. And I'm like, great. Good.
Great job.
Yes.
Very proud of you.
Thank you.
All right. Should we jump in?
Yeah, let's jump in.
What are we talking about this week?
So I'm doing this episode this week. And I thought, since it is April, which is Earth Month, and also because you mentioned I have a small business where I make science communications material, and I kind of started that business in the climate tech space. I should really do a climate person because we haven't done a climate person yet. So today we are going to be talking about Guy Callendar, who is the first person to really put together that humans have an effect on the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere and are actually contributing to climate change.
Oh, wow. That's huge. I feel like that's like a huge part of what we talk about with climate change, like just in the conversation in general, is like human impact on how this works. So that sounds super exciting.
Yeah, because obviously there's a lot of scientists that kind of put together the whole entire story, but he put together this like one very crucial piece, and we don't hear about him that much. So
yeah, I've never heard of him.
Okay, so let's get into the story. So Guy Callendar was born on February 9th, 1898 in Montreal, Canada, to Hugh Longbourn Callendar and Mary Victoria Stewart. Guy had an older brother, Leslie, and an older sister, Cecile. And as in many of these stories that we've told so far, their father, Hugh, had a really great academic reputation. In 1885, Hugh was working in Cambridge University, and there he developed a platinum resistance thermometer, which measures the temperature of something by measuring its electrical resistance, which is proportional to temperature. So Hugh's thermometer allowed people to accurately measure temperatures that they hadn't been able to before, like really high temperature things like metal alloys. And that was really helpful to construction workers and metallurgic engineers who needed to measure those kinds of things. And over the years, he made many different types of thermometers that were either more precise or had a higher range than before. And he even made medical thermometers that were connected to temperature recording devices, so you could stick the thermometer in a patient and get a readout over time.
Oh, yeah.
So eventually, Hugh moved to Canada to become a physics professor at McGill University. Here he worked on a bunch of things. He worked on the thermodynamics of steam engines, medical X-ray photography, and even experiments that looked at how the temperature of soil changed relative to its depth. So he was just kind of like all over the place.
Yeah.
And in fact, he was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Physics 3 times, although he never actually won it.
Wow. That, like, as a young person, he was nominated?
Well, I mean, we're talking about his father, so...
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. We're talking about Hugh. I'm just setting the scene for, like, this is his family. Yeah. So
Got
this
it.
is
Okay.
his father.
This is the dad.
Yeah. This is the dad, yes. So the dad was nominated for the Nobel Prize 3 times.
She's back on track.
Yes. Good. But he wasn't a total nerd. He also was into sports. He played tennis, lacrosse, and was on the shooting team at McGill. And in his free time, because he apparently still had some free time, he liked to tinker with car engines and motorcycles, and it was like a really big hobby of his.
I feel like there's a lot of tinkerers in our repertoire.
A lot of tinkerers.
Yeah.
So Guy, who we're actually talking about, was born Guy was born into this family. And before his first birthday, his father is offered a very lucrative position back in England at the University College London, which is where our friend Joseph Lister had gone to school about 50 years ago. Fun fact. So the Callendar family moves back to England, and this is where Guy grows up. His father bought a car, modified it to fit 5 passengers, and would take the family for high-speed joy rides around the English countryside.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
High speed joyrides with your whole family. Love that energy.
Yeah. And I was also thinking like high speed must have been like 50 miles an hour or something
I know.
at the time. It was like,
Also, what does modified to fit 5 people mean? Like, where did he just like strap on an extra seat, or like what's the situation?
Kind of like I'm not sure, and I was kind of scared to find out. I was like, I don't know what that means, and maybe that is something that's best left unanswered because Guy couldn't have been like more than 3 at this point, so I'm sure it was super safe.
I'm sure it was super safe. This reminds me, one of my friends is a pediatrician, and she was talking about how old-timey car seats were basically like a basket with a piece of rope across the
God,
lap that just like holds your baby in. And so you just like think about what car seats look like now, where they're like, you know, like super strapped in and really protected. And then it was like really just like a basket, and it wasn't even that old-timey, but then this makes me think of that where like you just like strap a kid on to the side of your car.
Yeah.
They're just cruising around the countryside.
Yeah. But thanks to Hugh's professorship and royalties from all his thermometers that he had patented, they were soon able to move into a lavish 22-room house with 2 garages where Hugh could work on his cars, a large library, a full-size sports lawn, a putting green, and a flower garden.
Wait, they did this off of thermometer money?
This is like professorship money. Yeah. Professorship and thermometer patents bought them this house.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
22 rooms?
I know. In 1905, Hugh and Victoria had one more child, Max. So that's Guy's little brother now. And all 4 children were highly encouraged to play and explore. Hugh turned the greenhouse into a laboratory and let his kids tinker around in there. Although I think maybe they were given a little bit too much freedom because apparently Guy's older brother, Leslie, almost blew up the greenhouse while trying to make TNT.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
This sounds like the Alfred Nobel story where they were just like running around like blowing stuff up and like there's no safety protocols in place.
Exactly.
No car seats, no safety, blowing stuff up the greenhouse.
And also, for some reason, it's not known why, but Leslie stuck a pin in Guy's left eye, leaving him partially blind for the rest of his life.
Oh my, a pin?
Yeah.
Dude.
Just older brothers will be older brothers, I guess. I think people who grew up with older brothers must be like a different breed if that's the type of shenanigans they get up to.
Way more resilient than me.
Yes. But I mentioned that because it will become important later, so.
Okay. He's partially blind.
Yes. In 1913, Guy enrolled in high school at St. Paul's in Hammersmith. But 2 years later, a couple of things happened that really disrupted this kind of idyllic life that he had. His older sister, Cecile, whom he loved very much, tragically died from pneumonia at the age of just 19. Also, World War I started, and this had a huge impact on his school life because many students and teachers at St. Paul were extremely patriotic, so a bunch of them decided to enlist. Mm-hmm. The school itself was also transformed with shortened instruction hours to avoid air raids and to make up for the lack of teachers. And military drills and bayoneting practice even became part of the curriculum.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah. But Guy did not enjoy this at all. He was still going through the very deep emotional shock of losing his sister. And he seemed to find the war to be this really horrible thing that would just cut short the lives of many more young people. So while he was patriotic, the thought of all of the violence was just very disturbing to him. But thanks to his older brother Leslie sticking a pin in his eye, Guy was ineligible for combat because he was blind in the one eye. So that worked out.
Not good. It's like not good, but like maybe a little good.
Yeah, a little good.
You know, have you seen like all the TikToks about people who are like, if there's a draft now, like there's no way like anyone would go like we're not resilient. Like if we get drafted now, like all of us are gonna like simply perish.
Yeah, it's gonna be horrible. Yeah.
Like, can you imagine like the average like Gen Zer or millennial?
Oh my God, no.
Being drafted.
Oh my God.
It would be so bad.
It would be terrible. Okay, so he can't go to combat. So instead he went to work at his father's lab in Imperial College as a technician, where he worked on aircraft engines, learned about the electromagnetic spectrum, and gained experience using hydrophones to detect submarines. So just a lot of random all-around experience.
What is a hydrophone?
It's like a thing, like a microphone that you stick into the water, and then it can detect sounds from submarines. So hydro
cool.
for water, microphone, hydrophone. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. So after the war was over, Guy officially enrolled in Imperial College and earns a degree in mechanics and mathematics. He graduated in 1922 and immediately started working in his father's physics lab on steam engines. He helped his father gather research to update what was known as the Callendar steam tables, which was a standard reference book where scientists and engineers could look up information about the properties of steam and other gases at various temperatures and pressures. So it was like this extremely important book for people who are working on thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, and material sciences. So they put out like a new edition every year or every few years with updated data, and Guy helped his father with that.
Are steam engines the norm right now in this time period?
I think so, yeah. So we're kind of like just a couple decades into the industrial era right now. So, yeah.
Okay, so that's like the primary source of energy right now is like coal and steam?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Guy also published his first paper with his father in 1926.
It's kind of great that he got to go then just like work in his dad's lab. You know?
I know.
We love a Nepo baby.
Yes. Yeah, and my next thing is actually about that. Like he worked with his father for 8 years, and overall they had a great relationship. His father was super supportive of them. They both were great at sports. Guy especially liked tennis and bicycling, and he also picked up his father's love of motorcycles and working on car engines. They were both described as hardworking, detail-oriented, and soft-spoken, and although they prioritized their work over their social lives, they were both very committed to their families. So, great relationship overall.
Yeah, that's really cute. Does he, so he's like still with his parents. He's not his family yet, right?
Yeah, right. We're about to get there.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, so okay. No. But yeah, you're right. So in 1930, Hugh Callendar dies of pneumonia, and he left all of his steam research and any royalties related to his work on steam engines to Guy.
What about the other kids?
Well, that was just the steam engines part. Remember, he was like all the thermometers and everything else in the world that he was working on was probably split up. So
okay.
This was just
the research,
the steam stuff.
Guy.
Yeah, the steam research and the steam engine patents were all to Guy. The same year in 1930, Guy got married to a woman named Phyllis Burden Pentreath. Not a whole lot is known about how they met and fell in love, but it's suspected they may have met at the Ealing Tennis Club because they both love to play.
That's cute.
Yeah. Although Guy was more competitive and actually liked to take part in tournaments, whereas it seemed like Phyllis was more of a recreational player. So they were married and they had identical twin daughters, Anne and Bridget, whom Guy absolutely adored.
That is so cute.
Yeah.
He really does give me girl dad energy, though.
He absolutely was. There's like pictures of him like at the beach with his family, and he's just like in love with the both of them. So
like when you were like, oh, he's like kind of soft spoken and kind of gentle, and he likes his family, but he's like still kind of nerdy. Like that gives me girl dad energy.
Yeah, absolutely. He absolutely was. So after his father's death, Guy really steps up into the role of England's premier steam engineer. He continues to publish editions of the Callendar steam tables. And between 1929 and 1934, Guy attended a series of conferences called the International Steam Table Conferences. And I was just like thinking, they really will have a conference for anything. Like some of the
Dude,
conferences that I've attended are so niche.
so
Like,
niche. But then there's like hundreds of people there, so that also
yeah,
like doesn't really make sense. It like
yeah,
seems niche, but it's not. I'm with you.
yeah. So the first conference in 1929 was really Guy's introduction to the world as one of England's top steam engineers. A short while later, in 1930, Guy met another scientist named Alfred Egerton, who had come to Imperial College to see Guy's steam apparatus. At first, Alfred wasn't super impressed with Guy, saying that he was quote unquote lacking fire. But after he saw an experiment being carried out on the apparatus, he realized that Guy was actually very smart and dedicated, just a very quiet and reserved person. So Alfred and Guy set up a collaboration for a series of experiments that they presented together at the Second International Steam Table Conference in Berlin. And in fact, their partnership lasted their whole life, and Guy even made Alfred the godfather to one of his daughters.
Oh,
Yeah.
very cute.
Yeah.
This is so wholesome.
The third and last International Steam Table Conference happened in the USA, and it was an attempt by scientists to, quote, standardize the actual and theoretical behavior of steam at high temperatures and pressures, unquote.
I don't even know what that means.
I think there was a lot of like arguing especially between America and European scientists as to some of the like actual data as to how to measure steam and how to measure temperatures and how to measure pressures and which way was most accurate, and whether we could rely on certain instruments and things like that. And so they were having a conference to figure out if they could come up with a standardized way to be able to measure those kinds of things, I believe. I don't know. I'm
Gotcha.
pulling this out of nothing.
And we care about this because the primary source of energy was steam. So to like think about how to optimize engine function or machinery function, we need to know all the properties of steam in order to harness that in the best way possible.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So Guy had to make the long transatlantic trip to America, and this was the first time he had been away from home for such a long time, and he got incredibly homesick. He wrote a series of letters to his wife that he always started with, "My dearest Phyllis," and would always end with something like, "Your ever-loving Guy," or "Your own devoted Guy."
Goals.
Like, so cute. And his colleagues and his colleagues would say that he was also very much the proud father who would whip out a photograph of his daughters literally any chance he got. It's like constantly talking about his family.
My heart.
Yeah.
So cute.
And that's really like the only way we actually know about their relationship and like how much he loved his family, those letters, because the rest of the time he was always at home and he didn't keep any diaries or anything. So these kind of quote unquote love letters that he wrote during this time are really the main window we have into him and his family.
Yeah. And it sounds like he was really soft-spoken and sort of private too. So he wasn't really, running around talking about this. So that makes sense.
Yeah. The conference in the US was a tremendous success, and Guy's work and visibility in the community really benefited from the experience. But overall, he was thrilled to just be able to return back home to his family.
Honestly, relatable. This is how I feel.
Same.
We've talked about this a lot. We like to be at home.
Yes, we are homebodies.
We are homebodies. We get it, Guy.
Yeah. So for the next couple of years, things are moving along smoothly. Guy has cemented his reputation as England's leading steam and combustion engineer. And at this point, I think a number of things start to kind of come together for him. First of all, his research as a steam engineer probably meant he was reading a lot of literature on water vapor and gases and how they reacted under different conditions. So he had that going for him. Second, kind of tangentially to that, is that he carried over his dad's interest in developing tools that accurately measured and recorded constantly fluctuating temperatures and pressures. And then the third kind of random thing was that he was always keeping track of the weather to see how it would affect any of the upcoming tennis matches he was in. And
interesting.
Yeah. And so over time, all of these things kind of naturally seemed to lead to an interest in climatology. and he started reading about the Earth's atmosphere and how it affected global temperatures.
Is climatology already a thing at this point?
Well, meteorology was. There definitely was the Royal Meteorological Society or something.
Society, yeah.
Yeah, so there
So
was
that's
that.
weather as a whole, but then
Mm-hmm.
what would be the difference between that and climatology?
I'm not 100% sure. Let's see. Can look up climatology versus meteorology. Okay, so let's see. Meteorology is the study of weather and weather forecasting. Climatology is focused on the natural and artificial forces that influence long term weather patterns.
Okay. So it's almost like short versus long term, just
Yeah.
very, very broadly. So it's like thinking about what's going to happen next week versus what's going to happen years from now or what has happened.
Yeah,
Okay.
like
That makes
looking at
sense.
trends, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's starting to study up on the Earth's atmosphere, and so for a bit of context, he starts looking at work that has been done by scientists in the 19th century. So in the 1820s, a physicist named Joseph Fourier discovered that the Earth was actually warmer than it should be based on its distance from the sun.
Interesting.
He wasn't sure why, but he did hazard a guess that maybe it was the Earth's atmosphere, but he wasn't nailing that as the main cause.
That that is crazy that he figured out like what it should be and that it's not what it should be, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. He was like, based on how far we are from the sun, the Earth should actually be colder than it is. Weird. Yeah. In 1856, Eunice Foote had demonstrated that gases, specifically carbon dioxide, could trap heat from the sun, which suggested that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere could also trap heat to keep the Earth warm, kind of like a greenhouse.
Mm-hmm.
In 1859, John Tyndall was the first to formally demonstrate that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was, in fact, causing a quote unquote greenhouse effect. And in 1896, Svante Arrhenius was able to quantify global warming.
I definitely did not know that like the term global warming predated the 1900s. Like
Yes.
to me that seems like Al Gore made that up. And obviously
Yeah.
that's not true, but
No. Yeah, I know,
that's
but I know what you mean. It kind of surprised me how far back this went. Like 19th century is so long ago.
yeah.
But it is also important to note that these scientists that were studying this were studying it as a very natural phenomenon and one that was beneficial to life on
Mhm.
Earth, because if the Earth actually didn't have an atmosphere and we didn't have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then the Earth's average surface temperature would be 0 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 18 degrees Celsius.
Right.
And at that temperature, all water on Earth would be frozen, and that would make life on Earth pretty much impossible. So, yeah, so these scientists were really seeing it as a good thing.
That makes a lot of sense though, because what was the guy's name who said that the Earth is warmer than it should be?
Joseph Fourier.
Yeah. So then maybe it was just the based on the fact that Mercury and Venus don't have atmospheres, and so are
Yeah.
going to be at a different temperature, and then there's this insulation around the Earth, which then allows it to be warmer than it quote unquote should be. So then
Yeah.
that makes sense because I think I'm primed, especially like in the age we live in, to think about this as a negative thing. It's like hotter than it should be. So in my head, it's like, oh, the earth is warming and it's
Yeah.
hotter than it should be based on, historical data. But
Mhm.
in this context, the scientist is really just saying it's just hotter than we're expecting it to be. And it's probably because we have an atmosphere. And like that's the discovery.
And that's a great thing, and that's
It
a
is a
good
great
thing.
thing. And
Yeah,
it's a good
it
thing.
like
Yeah,
it
yeah.
helped life on Earth become
Right.
possible. So, yeah,
But that context helps.
yeah, they were very much looking at it as a natural, beneficial
Right.
thing that Earth had an atmosphere with carbon dioxide in it, and that warmed the Earth enough for life to exist. So,
That makes a lot of sense.
yeah. So it wasn't until 1899 when an associate of Arrhenius, Niels Ekholm, pointed out that the industrial era had just started in 1850. So, what about all the coal and oil that humans were burning to fuel industry and build things? That released additional carbon dioxide into the air. And that was really the first time that people even considered the possibility that human activity might affect the atmosphere or might
Mhm.
affect the climate. But many scientists immediately started to push back against that idea, saying that any additional carbon dioxide humans would have emitted would have no effect on the climate, or that fluctuations would be temporary. But overall, the Earth is this huge, massive thing, and we humans are so small. And the Earth has ways of dealing with carbon dioxide. Like we have all these carbon cycles, we have forests and oceans that absorb carbon dioxide naturally. So humans couldn't possibly have a very large or lasting effect on the environment. That's what they were
Yeah.
saying.
Honestly, like I get it. It does feel difficult to fathom, right? It's like you think about, this is not what they're doing, but it's like you like burn a fire. It's like, okay, like I burned a fire. And then you think
Yeah.
about even just the smoke dissipates and then like smells dissipate. And if you think about extrapolating that to gases, then like gases dissipate. So then it's hard to imagine that the earth is so big. It's like, are we really making a dent
Yeah.
in this? Like
We're so tiny. Like,
sorry, I'm not a climate naysayer, I should say for the record, but
yeah.
I get I get it.
No, yeah, I totally get it too. I'm like, yeah, what could I possibly do? What I'm just this tiny little human.
Right.
I'm so small, like I can't possibly affect anything. Yeah. So I totally get that. Um, but Guy was not convinced. He was reading these papers and looking at the data that these people were using to say that humans couldn't affect the climate. And he found that in many of those papers, the methods that they used to gather the values of carbon dioxide and water vapor in the atmosphere were out of date and unreliable.
Hmm.
So in 1934, Guy started gathering his own data on weather and temperature. And importantly to note, he was not doing this in a lab. He wasn't given any kind of grant money or anything. He was just literally at his house doing this in his spare time. And it just became like this intense hobby of his. He started filling dozens of research notebooks with data of global temperature trends from over 200 weather stations around the globe.
Wow.
Um,
Wait, so
yeah.
these are just okay, so pre-internet. So
Mhm.
we can't look up the temperature somewhere. And so how are all these weather stations talking to each other? Like is there a place where it's like all posted or like do they release atlases or
I feel like there must be some publications, yeah, like
okay.
like the Smithsonian Institute would release this report that no one read except for Guy,
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
like
So it would
those
be
kinds of things. Um, but he also started measuring the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and looking at the infrared properties of various gases, which would allow him to calculate their warming effect on the Earth. Someone just rang our doorbell and my dog is going nuts. Sorry.
That's okay. He's like, "Hello."
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Anyway. So he also starts measuring the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the infrared properties of various gases, which would allow him to calculate their warming effect on the Earth. And he starts studying the carbon cycle. So he starts really digging into how do the Earth's forests and oceans and living organisms absorb and emit carbon dioxide naturally.
Yeah.
So after 3 or 4 years, in 1938, Guy published his first paper on the subject, which has become his most cited work. And it was called The Artificial Production of Carbon Dioxide and Its Influence on Temperature. And in this paper, the first thing he asked was how much carbon dioxide had been emitted into the atmosphere due to burning fossil fuels.
Mhm.
So he had gathered information on industrial activities, how much coal and oil they needed, and how much of these kinds of activities were happening around the world. And putting all of that together, he calculated that humans had emitted about 150 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the air between the years of 1900 and 1938.
That is a crazy number and also just like so impressive that he was able to estimate that.
Yes.
And I also am just really loving the title of his paper. Like it's so simple, but it's so clear too because it's the artificial production, which then insinuates that there is a natural production, which
Yes.
talks about the carbon cycle and what we would expect and the normal, or I guess the expected release of carbon dioxide relative to this spike based on human activity. So I really like that, and very impressive that he was able to come up with all of this.
Yeah, because you have to think like the carbon dioxide that existed in our Earth's atmosphere naturally had to come from somewhere. And it did
Somewhere,
come
right?
from, trees dying will emit carbon dioxide, animals dying or organisms dying. Yeah, they'll all emit carbon dioxide. Yeah, it does exist naturally. And he's really making that distinction here that we're not talking about that. We're talking about the artificial production of carbon dioxide. Yeah, so humans had emitted about 150 billion tons of carbon dioxide between 1900 and 1938. And I tried to put that into some sort of context. So if you imagine a 27 foot by 27 foot by 27 foot cube
Okay.
that was filled with carbon dioxide gas, that would be 1 ton. Or if you were to fly from Boston to London, that flight would emit about 1 ton per passenger.
Okay.
Or if you were to drive from Boston to Salt Lake City, Utah, that drive is about 2,500 miles, and that drive would emit about 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So now you have to imagine 150 billion flights to London or car rides across the US.
A billion is just a very difficult number to fathom.
It's huge.
And I think a million is something you can wrap your head around. I'm just talking about myself. Maybe a million is something I can wrap my head around, but billion is always way more than I'm expecting it to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a ridiculously high number.
So 150 billion is
Billion.
actually crazy number.
Yeah.
And that's just from 1950 to, what did you say the dates were?
1900 to 1938.
Yeah, see, that's not a long time.
Yeah, 38 years.
What is that number now? Do you know?
It's going to get worse.
Oh, we're going to get there. Okay.
We're going to get there.
Okay.
It gets worse.
I'm sure it gets worse. I'm just wondering how worse.
Yeah. So his next question was, could the Earth handle that? Yeah. Yeah. So could the forests and oceans absorb that carbon dioxide?
Spoiler.
Yeah. So to figure that out, he looked at what the concentration of carbon dioxide gas was in the atmosphere over time. So he found that between 1900 and 1938, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere had increased from 283 parts per million to 300 parts per million. So he ran the calculations and found that that meant that about 3/4 of the 150 billion tons of carbon dioxide that humans had emitted was still hanging around in the atmosphere. So Earth's natural carbon cycles had only been able to absorb about 1/4 of it over the last 38 years.
So it's like he's discovered that there's like a backlog now of carbon dioxide.
We have put extra into the atmosphere that the Earth has not been able to handle.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, he asked, well, does that have any effect on the Earth's surface temperatures? So he looked at the infrared properties of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and calculated its radiative effect, or how much it had the ability to trap heat based on how high up it was in the atmosphere.
Uh-huh.
And he found that an increasing concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, especially at lower levels of the atmosphere where it was closer to the Earth, did in fact raise the radiative effect, which would mean that the Earth would get warmer. And to further prove this, as I said, he had been gathering temperature data from around the world and found that over the years, there was a 0.005 degrees Celsius annual increase in the temperature. So over 38 years, that means that the temperature had increased about 0.2 degrees Celsius total between 1900 and 1938. And what I found really most amazing about this is that he was able to extrapolate this data and predict that if the concentration of carbon dioxide were to double, global warming would increase by 2 degrees Celsius.
That's a huge jump.
And that's where we are today. That's exactly what scientists are warning us about now, and why everyone's in an uproar about climate change, because we are moving in on that 2 degrees Celsius mark.
Are we at 2 degrees right now?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. But he
Yeah,
predicted
so
this in like the mid 1900s.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's compare to today and see where we are, right?
Yeah.
So, Guy had estimated that humans had emitted 4.3 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in 1938 alone, just that year.
Okay.
Today, we are emitting about 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. So, nearly 10
Damn.
times as much. Yeah, nearly 10 times more.
That is crazy.
So, yeah. So he had said between 1900 and 1938, humans had emitted 150 billion tons over like 38 years.
Mhm.
And now we're emitting 40 billion tons just every year. So every 4 years, we're already, going past that mark. It's
Yeah.
insane.
It's really like an exponential increase for sure.
Oh, yeah, 100%. So he also calculated the carbon dioxide concentration. So that was 300 parts per million in 1938. Today we're at 412 parts per million. So over 100 parts per million higher.
These are
Yeah.
very staggering numbers. I'm having like a really hard time grappling with them.
Yes, it's crazy. And then he also found that the surface temperature of the Earth had increased by about 0.2 degrees Celsius.
Mhm.
Today, the temperature is about 1 degree Celsius warmer.
Mhm.
Um, but given that we are emitting 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide each year, we are very much on track to reach 2 degrees Celsius of warming in the next 20 years or so if we don't make a change. And so that's what scientists are so worried about. And that's why everyone is trying to make this push to limit the amount of fossil fuels we're
Right.
burning and change our lifestyles to adapt to the changing climate. So,
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And so the 2 degrees hasn't happened yet, but he predicted this many years ago.
and the International Panel on Climate Change is trying to say, like, we need to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. But a lot of people are saying we're already going to go past that mark.
Right.
So 2 degrees is kind of our upper ceiling that we're really trying hard to avoid. But
Yeah.
I don't know what our chances are of that if we don't have the whole world needs to cooperate on this, and we need to get everyone on board. So it's tough.
Yeah.
Um, but back to Guy. So this link between human activity and the rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere came to be known as the Callendar effect. And Guy's calculations proved to be pretty much spot on. The only thing, like we were just saying, that he didn't predict really was the fact that we'd be facing these consequences so quickly. I
Mhm.
think he just had no idea the amount of carbon dioxide humans would be emitting today. And so he thought, oh, if things just kind of continue the way they had been between 1900 and 1938, and they just kept emitting about 4 billion tons each year, it would take centuries before we saw any kind of effect. And so he really wasn't concerned. He was actually more approaching this as kind of like, hey, look at this cool thing I found. Humans are, in fact, influencing the climate. And that might even be a good thing because warmer temperatures would mean the world would become more like the tropics everywhere. We would have better plant growth. We'd have thriving ecosystems, and we could stave off quote unquote deadly glaciers.
It's so interesting to think about how all of these scientists had the perspective of it was like kind of positive. It was just like an interesting phenomenon and like obviously like discovering something new and putting in the perspective of like a new piece of knowledge is really positive and really exciting. And I think we are just so primed with the news cycle and everything that's in the media of how bad all of this is. So thinking about,
Yeah.
temperatures increasing and thinking about, the earth getting hotter, like in my head is like immediate alarm bells. I'm like, bad, bad, bad. But
Yeah.
he hadn't quite got to the point of how quickly this would happen and the degree of negative repercussions that would have happened. So it is kind of interesting to think about his perspective was just so different.
Yeah, and that is actually one of the things that's like juxtaposed about him quite a lot is that like he discovered this thing that humans are emitting carbon dioxide into the air and warming up the planet, And then he turned right around and went to go tinker with his car engines and take joyrides on his motorcycle. Like,
Yeah.
he was like very much unconcerned that this would be a problem. Yeah.
Right. Right.
But even back then, people had a really hard time believing him. And for the rest of his life, Guy was continually surprised and confused at how much pushback he was receiving from other meteorologists. There were many who believed his work, of course, but for those who expressed skepticism, Guy just couldn't understand why they were having such a hard time believing that humans were actually contributing to the greenhouse effect.
Mhm.
Over the next several years, he published a total of 10 scientific papers on the topic of climate change, where he kept updating his findings. On one paper, he wrote, quote, "The 5 years, 1934 to 38, are easily the warmest such period at several stations, whose records commenced up to 180 years ago."
Wow, that is a huge change over not a very big period of time. I wonder how he would feel about the fact that people still don't believe that climate change is happening.
Yeah, I know. It's so clear. And especially since then, scientists have backed up his findings.
Like
Like,
many times over. Yeah.
we have better tools to measure things now. Yeah, I don't know. But although he's faced a fair amount of skepticism, many prominent meteorologists applauded him and said that Guy's work had created a new standard for how meteorological data should be collected and analyzed. His methods and calculations showed so much attention to detail that Guy figured the only reason the so called skeptics were saying they didn't believe his work was because they were jealous that they had been shown up by an amateur. Um, because remember, he had been doing all of this from his house, like
Yeah.
with no grant money, no fancy equipment. And he wasn't trained as a meteorologist himself. And so all these meteorologists who were saying, like, oh no, there's no way humans can affect the climate. And he just came in with yes, they can. Here's all the data that I've been meticulously collecting and analyzing, and you guys should have done this level of work. You guys should have done this job. I did your job for you. You're welcome. And they were all just jealous of him. So
I know. It is so interesting too that he was thinking about it in the context of historical data too, because it doesn't seem like that was the norm and the standard thinking about the weather and meteorology. It does seem like it was much more forward thinking, and he is looking at historical data and comparing all of them and thinking about how it changes over time. So the approach itself is also, I think, pretty fascinating.
Yeah, definitely looking at the longer term trends here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so at this point, it's 1939 and World War II started. And remember, again, like, Guy was doing this climate stuff all in his spare time. His real job was being a steam engineer. But because of the war, he was essentially forced to wind down his steam research. And by 1941, Guy's steam work was officially shut down, and Guy had to put out feelers for a job. So everyone who knew him knew he was an excellent scientist, but his expertise in steam engineering was so niche that it wasn't really clear how his skills would translate to other fields.
Mm-hmm.
He temporarily got a job working on batteries and fuel cells with the hopes that scientists could create a reliable source of electricity for soldiers to have on the field during battle. However, in 1942, Guy was officially assigned to work at the Armament Research Department at Langhurst. And here he was put on another really cool project that I did not know about. He was put to work on a project directed by the Petroleum Warfare Department, or the PWD. The PWD was interested in developing different ways to use burning oil to help them in the war. A really big part of their program focused on creating weapons. And I was like, burning oil weapons literally means flamethrowers. Like, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Um,
Concerning, but carry on.
yeah. But in Guy's case, he was very much against violence, like he was in World War I. He did not want to work on that kind of program. So instead, he focused more on defense and was put on a project that actually really fit his interests in steam engineering and climatology perfectly. The problem was that pilots in the Royal Air Force often had a hard time taking off and safely landing their planes because the airfield was always covered in this super thick ground fog. And it was
Mm-hmm.
especially bad in the early mornings, but also the weather in England is just notoriously foggy. And at the time, nearby industrial and domestic chimneys were burning
Oh,
coal
yeah.
and would emit smog. And the smog just encouraged the formation of fog even more because the water droplets would cling to the little particles of smog. And so the fog got so thick that even if they put lights on the runway, the pilots couldn't see them.
Hmm.
So these pilots are trying to take off or land these planes on a runway that they can't see, and they don't have fancy gadgets to help them, and they had to rely mostly on sight to do this.
Yeah, that's
And
crazy.
so often enough the plane would end up crashing, destroying the plane and killing the pilot.
Jesus.
Yeah. So it's like you're already fighting a war, that's bad enough. And then on top
I
of that, you might crash on reentry.
I recently watched Band of Brothers with my partner. Have you heard of this?
I've heard of it. I haven't watched it.
The HBO
Mm-mm.
series. It's pretty old, but it's on Netflix, and they do talk about this a lot because they're trying to fly these planes, and they can't see. And like a big point of contention is that there's now all these planes that are flying through the sky, and they're like dropping bombs and like all these things, but they can't see where their targets are, and they also can't take off and
Oh,
land. So it's like a big point of like when they drop soldiers and they do like the drops with like parachutes,
yeah.
they land in the wrong places because they're dropped not where they're supposed to be because they can't see.
Oh. Yeah, and it's all like just based on eyesight, right? Like there's
Yeah.
no like today we have computers and like, these gadgets that can tell you exactly where you are and everything. Like you have all these GPS kind of
Yeah.
very pinpoint accuracy type of things that can tell you. So like no matter what weather you're in, rain or shine, fog or clear, it doesn't matter. You can know exactly where you are and where you're dropping your bombs or where you're landing your plane. But this is before all of that.
Right.
So Guy was part of a project called FIDO, or Fog Investigation and Dispersal Operation, which was a program to see if they could heat up the landing area using a system of petroleum tanks, pipes that ran along the length of the runway, and burners that would ignite the petroleum in the pipes to raise the temperature of the airfield and disperse the fog.
In theory sounds good, but that sounds what?
Yeah. So I
Like I
know
get it, but
it
also what?
sounds insane. It sounds insane. And I actually saw an old video from the British Royal Air Force of this that I can post on the website so others can see it too. But this plane is coming into land, and there's just like two lines of fire on each side of the
No.
runway.
Mm-mm. No.
Yeah.
So like in, like old-timey circuses where they were like jumping through hoops of fire, like
Yeah.
that's yeah.
Yeah, that's like exactly what it was. One pilot described their initial landings with the new FIDO system like a quote descent into hell.
What about the smoke from the fire though? Like wouldn't that add to like the
Apparently
situation?
that burned off really quickly, and I think that was also part of Guy's job to kind of
Okay.
find
Make sure
ways
there wasn't
to
more particles in the air.
yeah, exactly. Um yeah, but soon enough these pilots got used to the FIDO system, and it really actually did help with visibility. It was almost like they could turn on and off the fog. So you turn on the burners, the fog would dissipate. You turn off the burners, the fog would come back.
That's like still crazy though. Like a runway isn't that big. Like it's not that wide. But then you think about people doing this during World War II and there's fire on both sides. Like it
Yeah.
feels like
It's like
it's like playing did you play Operation as a kid where you have to
yes.
like do that's what it feels like.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So Guy helped design several key components of the system and held part of the patent on it. The system burned a ridiculous amount of petroleum and was super expensive to build and operate.
Can you imagine proposing something today where you're just like, we're just gonna light a bunch of petroleum on fire
There would be so many concerns. I
and then
mean,
operate heavy machinery around it?
yes, it would never happen. But this was only ever used during the war effort because during peace times, pilots could just wait for the fog to go away. So it was only used when the war was going on, and it was actually estimated to have saved hundreds or even thousands of pilots' lives. So after the war, Guy stayed at Langhurst for another 12 years, and he continued to work on military defense systems. He evaluated a device called the Dragon, which was a self-contained portable space heater that soldiers could use to heat up buildings or tents in cold climates. He also worked on developing ways to use high pressure systems to force liquids out of a container. And again, this kind of gave me flamethrower vibes, like, yeah. But most of his work is classified, so it's really hard to put together like an accurate picture of all the projects he worked on. But he
Okay.
was a very well respected engineer at Langhurst. And throughout all of this time, he continued his interest in climate change as well. So during the war, it was kind of hard to gather global information because, countries and their wartime secrets, no one wants to share information in case it could get used against them somehow.
Mhm.
But Guy was able to continue to collect data from weather centers. And in the end, he was collecting data from over 400 weather centers around the world.
Wow.
Yeah. And again, all in his spare time. Like it's
Yeah.
without computers, without the internet. It's
I think
just,
that's the craziest thing because it
yeah,
doesn't seem that insane to think right now about, looking at weather in all these different places because you can just save them all on your phone and you can just look at a bunch of different places at the same time. But it
yeah.
probably was very time consuming or time intensive to find all these weather stations, collect their data, then aggregate their data. They're probably not all in the same format.
Like today you can build an app that will do all of that, and just have it
Yeah.
running in the background of your whatever else you're doing.
I have like 4 or 5 cities saved right now in my iPhone of places
Yeah.
that I look at. So it's like
Exactly. So after the war, he even started doing a bit of communication for the public, writing about his work so that the general population would also start to take interest. And they did. News outlets like Time magazine reported that increases in industrial CO2 emissions could raise temperatures. The New York Times also cited Guy's work and discussed potential future problems due to increased temperatures like rising sea levels. And the Evening Post wrote about the possible effects of climate change, like shifts in agriculture, melting glaciers, mass migration of people who are all displaced from their homes. And this was all written in like the 1950s. And these are all things that we're actually actively dealing with today. So,
yeah, it's like a precursor to your job.
yeah, it's just crazy to think that people had this much of a heads up and we're still screwing it up somehow. Like we've known this for over 50 years, guys. Come on.
Yeah, I guess almost 100 years, right? Because if he
Yeah.
first published this in 1938, it's like we're coming up on 100 years.
Yeah, exactly. But that could be with the reason. So part of the reason that Guy's work is often overlooked is that in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a significant cooling trend in the Earth's temperatures, which basically seemed to undermine a lot of what he had been saying. And Guy himself was probably also a bit confused by this as well. He retired in 1958 and spent his last few years continuing to study the effects of carbon dioxide on the climate. But in the early 1960s, the winters were especially cold with heavy snowfalls and blizzards. So, although he stuck to his findings that the Earth had shown significant warming trends and that correlated with carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, it doesn't seem like he had a really solid explanation for those freezing cold winters.
Do we know why there was a cooling period?
I don't know why exactly, but I think that's why scientists have moved away from the term global warming and towards saying climate change.
Climate change. I see.
Yeah, because the actual effect of what we're seeing from the higher amounts of carbon dioxide are manifesting in all these different ways, right?
I see.
Like,
It's not just hotter, it's all of these
yeah.
other things. I see.
Yeah. So it's like, yes, the surface temperature of the Earth is increasing, but what we're actually observing as a result of that are these like temperature extremes. We get high, very high, like record breaking high temperatures every year practically. And then also these record breaking low temperatures.
Mhm.
We get droughts that last longer. We have hurricanes that just
Mhm.
are super destructive and dump a lot more water than they used to. Floods are worse. Like, everything is just extremely bad. Extremes. Right. Yeah. So,
Right.
and that's why I think like global warming as a term was a little bit misleading and just caused a lot of confusion. But that's kind of why we don't hear about Guy's work a lot, I think. So Guy died on October 3rd, 1964, from a coronary thrombosis at the age of 66. His family had had a history of heart problems, but it was still kind of a shock and pretty sudden. He was buried at the Sussex, Surrey crematorium, and his scientific colleagues immediately sent letters of condolences to his wife, Phyllis. A climatologist of the Royal Meteorological Society, Gordon Manley, wrote to her and said, "In what Sir Graham Sutton has described as the most deficient science in the world, your husband has made a most original and lively contribution. I myself heard it in 1938, and when he retired, he was quite indefatigable in slogging out the figures on which his and my arguments depend. I always enjoyed his letters for their crisp content and can assure you that in the Royal Meteorological Society, we have a very high esteem for the few scientists who can match up to and challenge the professionals of the meteorological office. I should like to assure you how the classic paper by G.S. Callendar stands as an original contribution nearly 20 years before the Americans began to think along similar lines."
I like that. I like that little zinger at the end.
And he finished off his letter by saying, "There's a permanent stock in science to which we may all hope to add, and your husband gained our esteem indeed for doing just that."
Love that.
Yeah, that, I guess, is about it. That's the story of Guy Callendar and the guy who figured out that humans were affecting the climate.
That was a great story. I learned so much. I had no idea that climate change and our knowledge of climate change went back that far. And this terminology has been around for so much longer than I thought it was.
Yeah. And it is quite, like, with my day job, it's quite heartening to know how many people are trying to fix this problem. But at the same time, it is a bit unnerving, I guess, to know that we've known about this for such a long time, and only just now are we starting to think of ways we can do things differently. So I really hope we can all get on board, guys. Like, figure this out.
Agree.
Yeah, it's a big problem.
Good timing for Earth Day coming up.
Yes. That's one of the reasons I wanted to do this story.
Great story. I loved it.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening. If you have a suggestion for a story we should cover or thoughts you want to share about an episode, reach out to us at smarttpodcast.com. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at smarttpodcast and listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And leave us a rating or comment. It really helps us grow. New episodes are released every other Wednesday. See you next time.